range. There's a range. In some places it is lower, in some cases it is higher. So renewables. As you can see, this is the data for the United States. Hydro has been constant, but the major growth has been the other non-hydro renewables, which if you look at that 85.7 gigawatts that has been installed, you find most of them has been wind, a little bit of solar, and other parts. And in terms of this is capacity, this is actual terawatt hours, and you can see that the same trends are happening. So renewables are growing. We almost doubled in the last 4 years or so. Solar photovoltaic, the DOE had a sunshot goal of $1 per watt by the end of this decade, by 2020, which amounts to levelized cost of electricity around $50 to $60 per megawatt hour, 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And that is about $1 watt hour of capex. And what you can see at the utility scale, at that time, by the way, in 2010, this was a stretch goal. And what we are seeing in the utility scale, it's less than $2. The majority of the cost is not in the panel. Even if the panel was free, the cost at the utility scale will be more than $1 per watt. And so the balance of system is the majority of the cost. This is global commercial, this is global residential, and that is slightly gone below $3 a watt, which is about 15 cents a kilowatt hours or so, roughly speaking, in terms of levelized cost. So this is going down. The question is how, where are the big opportunities and what do we need to do? What are the game changers out here? Storage. We heard storage, beautiful talk about storage. This is the status today. We have about 20 gigawatts of storage in the United States, which is really low compared to the amount of renewables that we really want in our grid. And most of it is pumped hydro. Only the little sliver on top is the other. You can't even see that. Most of it is pumped hydro. So what do we need to do? If you take that sliver of thing on the top and break it up, here's what is going on in megawatts now. And most of it is compressed air and all the batteries. So if there's any major change that needs to happen is how do we bring the non-hydro resources of our storage on board? And there's a tremendous amount of technology and techno-economics that is required out here. Energy efficiency, this is just the energy intensity in our commercial buildings, which is actually going down. So it's a right trend that we see. And there are not just technology, there are major policy issues to drive that, because there either is a price signal or a regulatory signal to drive. And if you have neither, it doesn't happen. And here's a policy twist to that, which is the decoupling policy, which California started in 1978. Now, major other states are actually adopting that, which will introduce energy efficiency into the system. But what are the technological gaps? And David and others are going to talk about that. That was the United States. Well, it's just very quickly about the world. This is the population density map in the world. And as you can see, majority of the population is elsewhere, not just the population density today. The growth of population, we're going to add 3 more billion people in this world within this century, and most of that is going to happen not in the United States, but mostly in Asia and Africa. All right? If you overlay on top of this the electricity use, you find immediately that population and electricity use do not correlate. There are about 1.4 billion people, as Bob mentioned earlier, who do not have access to electricity, and another 1.6 who have very limited access. So about 3 billion people have very limited access to electricity or no electricity. And we're adding 3 more billion people within this century in mostly those regions. If they start using electricity, what happens then? And how do we create an infrastructure which is leapfrogs over our infrastructure into something much better that will be sustainable in the long run? That's a major question, because we're looking at decarbonizing energy, our electricity sector. This is a major issue, because that's where the growth is going to be. So here are the framing questions for the panel. What will it take to produce, deliver, and use electricity from decarbonized sources at the terawatt scale? That's what is needed. And what are the game changes in technology that is required, both for all intermittent renewables, nuclear, geothermal? I can't imagine a world in the future of decarbonized electricity at a large scale without nuclear. So what do we need to do? Geothermal, carbon capture sequestration from coal and natural gas, What is the landscape in terms of capacity, cost, and lifecycle savings from reducing electricity demand? The energy efficiency angle to it. What are the other game changers that are inherently left field? Have we not covered something that we see is coming around the bend, but it's not quite there yet, that will create discontinuities in our energy landscape and trajectory? And then much of the world is the world issue. If you are to create the infrastructure for the 21st century, what are the game changers? Give us 3 recommendations what the world should be doing in this area. So I'm going to stop here, stop speaking. I'm going to let David pick up, and then Bert, and then Vladimir later.
Thank you, Arun. Same buffer, I guess. There we go. You've heard the phrase, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. If you were to take that phrase and put it in a Google translator, I'll have Arun check this later, you might actually get that a jewel in the hand is worth 10 in the ground. And the reason for that is because if you think about it, you look at the energy potential of what we're pulling out of the ground, by the time it does useful work in a building, it could be 1/10 of that, or in the case of incandescent light bulbs, much less. Now, there's certainly a lot of important technology that we're all developing. The university and national lab community and research institutions, RPE and others are really pushing that forward that are relevant to buildings. Things like solid-state cooling, nano-engineered membranes that can do humidity management, advances in terms of information technology, such as using model predictive control, the same approach used in modern jet engines on the F-35, you can bring for use inside buildings to really improve the performance of how you manage them. But what I want to focus on in the few minutes I have this morning is that on efficiency. And the reason is because when you think about Steve Koonen's chart shown earlier about timescale, you really wrestle with the fact that, if you think back to all the length of time it takes to change this, but yet you just think back to 2000 and people didn't have any statistics on text messaging. But yet today the average teenager, will send 3,000 or more in a month, and that's probably growing. You see that there's potentially an opportunity to take the fast time scale of what we're doing with regard to communication technology, sensing, and management in terms of using intelligent systems, and fuse that with how we use energy to fundamentally accelerate our reduction of energy use and really grab that low-hanging fruit with regard to energy efficiency. Why is this important? I think in an audience like this, you would know this chart, but it's amazing how many people don't, even professionals in the building field. Basically, it's the fact that buildings are the hidden, invisible user of energy, that over nearly 40% around the globe of all energy, not electricity, all energy is used in buildings. If you think about electricity, it's about 70%. If you add factories and all the energy-intensive processes in factories, you get up to about 70%. Aviation is just 2. Light-duty vehicles are only 16. If we could reduce energy use in buildings by 50%, you could do the equivalent of taking all the cars and light-duty vehicles off the road. And you could do it in reasonable time. Because this is not pie in the sky, it's achievable, but even though it's achievable, there's so many barriers that it actually hasn't been done in any significant way to this point. If you look at this globally, first, before globally, let's look locally. Inside the building, you can see the distribution in terms of both commercial and residential. Certainly with commercial, it's more about lighting. With residential, it's other things. But what's amazing is even with all our standards and how we've made refrigerators and other appliances in the home more efficient, there is still often the lack of engineers who design new things to have energy, as DoD would say, as a KPP, and a critical parameter that you say is critical to how I design my system. My example for that is a study, I think, by one of the national labs that illustrated the fact that the DVR set-top box you have in your home uses almost as much electricity as your refrigerator. You just think about that a little bit, and you think about all the other electronic systems in your home. Did it have to be that way? Absolutely not. But there was probably no premium, no reason, no driver for someone to think about from the beginning how to design that efficiently. If you have to do it later, then you get in all these arguments about cost. Is it worth doing that? If you do it from the beginning, it actually doesn't cost much more to design things energy efficiently from the beginning. And that's key in terms of what we have inside. Now the global picture. What this chart shows is the use in terms of the built environment, in terms of terawatt hours, across different regions of the world. So you see Brazil, China, India, and the EU 15. The dotted line is the US level in 2003. What the two color bars represent are projections for these regions of the world for 2050. The green bar says, let's assume that these other parts of the world adopt best-in-class standards, namely that of Japan. And so their energy intensity would be the best you could achieve. The gray is what if they do what we do, or have been doing in the US. What you see there is even if they adopt best-in-class, both India and China will far exceed where we are in the US, and it really creates a driver for that. So it's not only the population growth, but it's all the economic growth that even drives that harder. Some factoids you could use at reception or other things you go to in the future. China builds the equivalent of one Japan every 3 years. So if you think about urbanization. And the equivalent of one Europe every 10. And builds half of the world's new buildings. You know our company, we make elevators. We're selling more elevators now in Brazil than the US, and way more in China than we have in the US for a long, long time. And so if you look at that urbanization, you see that all this is being built, but those buildings will be there for a long time, so we have to get it right. Because if we don't get it right now, you can see the big difference between the green and the gray. It's encouraging to see, McGraw-Hill study showed that contrasting 2008 to today, whereas in 2008 only about 13% of the construction industry was focused on a significant amount of green projects, they project in 2015 it'll be as much as 51%. The challenge is if you were to map green or LEED buildings, as shown in this chart, in terms of the proposed savings and the actual savings realized, where you'd ideally be on this line, what you find is a lot of gold LEED buildings are actually worse than conventional buildings. And so what was desired in design is not actually realized in practice. And when you get that kind of scatter plot, it says, okay, these things that we see as potential and the harnessing of this really inflection point in interest in green and green buildings will not realize the benefit of the energy savings if we don't get that right. The other part, another study, this one by LBNL, if you look over time for different systems in a building, basically what you're seeing is for each of these, as you go a couple of years after the commissioning of the building, the amount of efficiency drops or the energy use goes down. So essentially things degrade over time. But we never know it because we're still comfortable in the room. But we don't know what's in the back of the room in the furnace closet is using more energy than it needs to. And I think this is in large part because we don't take a life cycle view. We often aren't good about how we design. That design often isn't realized in practice because there are value engineering choices made along the way. What a building is designed for, it's used in a different way because you have so many different people making decisions, from owners, architects, those who operate it later. And then when you think about operation and life cycle, we don't do enough to understand the actual use of those systems of the energy in the building. These are examples that it can be done. So if you remember Arun's chart earlier, he was showing sort of average of about 300 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Here are buildings in terms of, in the upper left, an energy retrofit that's just HVAC equipment. You can get 10–30% improvement. The number here is 300 kilowatt hours per meter squared. If you start looking at things with envelope management, humidity control, and things of that fashion, you get down to 150. And if you really push the state of the art and say, I don't want any air handlers and I want to use natural ventilation, you can get all the way down in a proven case of 75. The challenge is these things cost. The solutions often aren't scalable, and you want to think, how do we do this in a way that it's easy to repeat? Because certainly the economics around this could be very compelling with short paybacks. This is an example of the kind of work that needs to be done. Dorothy's former organization, ESTCP, and DOE as well, have focused on work on how we can develop the tools that allow one to make decisions in a portfolio basis and also thinking all the way from initial analysis to trading alternatives. Because the challenge today is, if you were to do a study, it may take you a month and a lot of money to decide what to do. If you now are like DOD that has hundreds of thousands of buildings, you say, can I afford to do that to even decide what to do? If you do back in the envelope, your information is not actionable because it's not accurate enough. But this work is giving people, in the course of a couple hours, tool sets that will now allow folks to look at whole portfolios. So the bottom right here, this sort of carpet plot that shows all the different bars, different colors, is actually the portfolio of all of DOD's buildings around the country, divided by climate zone, divided by building type, where one now, looking at it as a portfolio, can say, where's the best return on my investment as you trade different alternatives and say, okay, what will happen with that? And then using some of the advanced mathematics that we have now, we can begin saying what's the uncertainty? Because what you find often is people don't know actually the square footage of a building or the R factor of the roof. And so to wrap up, Arun had asked us for recommendations. It struck me the comment Secretary Schultz said earlier about reports that float around and sometimes just sit. I thought, I don't need to come up with any more. There are many that exist. Alliance to Save Energy 2030 report just came out recently, talks about how do we double energy productivity, focused on investment like we talked about, in R&D, but not only that, unlocking the financing so people can do what they need to with regard to energy efficiency, modernizing regulations and infrastructure so that things line up properly, so it's not like what Stanford found, where Santa Clara County requires you have a certain number of lights on for egress, even though the building has daylighting, so they have to leave lights on, they don't need to. Or to educate and really engage the human capital, because I think if we can do that, this is how things will become viral and really change. Last thing I would leave for myself is I think we really need to take a systems view. None of us, when we buy a car, ask what's the efficiency of the water pump. We don't ask, what about even the SEER of the air conditioning system in the car? You ask the miles per gallon. And when you drive that car, you may know what the EPA says, but you certainly know what the mileage per gallon is of that car as you use it. We have no clue with buildings. Once we start getting to a system view of buildings, of sets of buildings, of district, it will change how we approach it. And it'll change also what motivates what we do. So, thank you.
Bert?
Well, Arun wanted a terawatt. And 2 years ago today, we were on our way for a terawatt of new nuclear power by 2050. That was a nuclear renaissance. In the United States, there were 35 outfits who were looking for site licenses for nuclear power plants. 4 days later, we had the Japan earthquake and tsunami, the Fukushima meltdown, and the nuclear renaissance that was on the 7th of March was off on the 11th of March. Today, we're back on again in Asia, except for Japan. We're back on in parts of the Middle East. We're back on in Eastern Europe. And we're not really on, we just have a start up in the United States. Germany is an anomaly. It's decided to eliminate nuclear and replace it with nuclear electricity from France and coal-generated electricity from Poland. And by the way, it doesn't count in your greenhouse gas emissions under Kyoto where it's used, it's where it's produced. So this is a Poles problem, not a German problem. Okay, what do we have today? Today we have about 400 reactors deployed. They're mostly what's called Generation 2. Those were the first generation of power reactors that started coming online in the 70s. The United States has 100, a little more than 100 of them, and they generate 20% of our electricity, and the whole collection generates about 16% of the world's electricity. The new thing is called Generation 3 and 3+. That's what's getting built now. Those are going to be the workhorses of the fleet until something really new comes along. And those things are big, and they are already being produced in Asia, and there are 4 of them under construction today in the United States. The first new thing around are the small modular reactors. These are a spin-off of the Generation 3+, and their advantages are supposed to be more hands-off safety. The question is, can you get a bad thing like the tsunami, which turned off all electricity to Fukushima, and can you close your eyes and walk away for 3 days to a week? And that is purported to be one of the great features of the small modular reactors. The other thing that's really interesting about them is that the concept comes from industry, not from the laboratories. This is not something that was pushed by government, but pushed by industry, and it's got a lot of things that it does good. So if you think of a lot of small reactors in a distributed energy system, you are less vulnerable to serious disruptions, and that's a real worry now. Cost, the claim for small modular reactors is that they're all factory built, and although they're small, the fact that they're built in a factory trumps the field built much bigger reactors. So factory built trumps economies of scale, and it's supposed to come in at the same dollars per kilowatt hour. We'll have to see when we see them built. Generation 4 is a whole collection of different types of reactors that are in the R&D phase in various places around the world. You have to ask, why do you want them? Claim for Generation 4 is that some of them are even more passively safe. Some of them have big advantages in how you dispose of nuclear waste. Others have a much easier fuel cycle to manage. Others still are more proliferation resistant. We don't know what's going to win that race. There are a whole bunch of them going on sort of every place. The issues that people usually talk about and worry about with nuclear are here. Environmentally, you've got greenhouse gas emissions, radiation safety and waste disposal. Societal, the issues are capital costs and costs of electricity. As far as greenhouse gas is concerned, nuclear is among the lowest. Radiation from a normally operating plant is much, much less than natural background. Safety and health are better than fossil, including the effects of the accident, and I'll show you that in a minute. Waste is a political and not a technical issue. I want to say that very loudly. We're in Washington. It's a political issue, not a technical issue. We have a nuclear waste repository quietly operating in Carlsbad, New Mexico. It's called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. The neighbors love it. There are lots of jobs. Nobody's complaining about it. I leave it to you in Washington to fix our problem. Capital costs for the first few reactors built in the United States are probably going to be about twice the cost of the last group of reactors produced in Japan and Korea. And the reason is simply we haven't built one in a long time. We haven't turned on a new reactor in the United States in, I think, 30 years. And so our infrastructure is down. Electricity costs are much lower than wind and solar when you take the subsidies out. They are higher than natural gas. Expected from, since it's an MIT, Stanford program here, from the last MIT study on nuclear, is that nuclear electricity will be 6 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour with loan guarantees, and 8 to 11 without. We'll hope. The hope for the SMRs, as I say, is that they'll make things stabler, and we're going to wait on what happens with the Generation 4. Here's the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from all your favorite things. Life cycle means it includes the steel for the plant, the concrete for the plant, mining the fuel, whatever it is, preparing the fuel, transporting it, producing the electricity, and disposing of the waste. So coal is the worst. Natural gas is much better. The rest of them, nuclear, hydro, biomass, et cetera, are all very low. What has happened in the United States, I think to the surprise of most of the world, is US greenhouse gas emissions are going down. And the reason they're going down is because no new coal-fired power plants have been started in this country in, I think, nearly 4 years, and the amount of electricity generated from coal has gone from 50% down to 33%, and gas has gone from 20% up to 33%. Very interesting change. One of the big problems with nuclear is, let me say, fear of the nuclear things. The nuclear age was born in bombs. And having it born in bombs started off with having it pretty scary. This is years of life lost per terawatt hour of electricity generated. The data is from Europe. I can't find an analysis like this for the United States. Years of life lost, not lives lost. Air pollution usually shortens lives, for example. You can do whatever you want, but there you see what the surprises are. Coal is the worst. Photovoltaics is rather bad. That's because of the nasties used in making them. Gas is relatively good. Nuclear is much better, and the only thing better than that is wind. There's a National Academy of Sciences study called The Hidden Cost of Energy, and I could recommend it to everybody here because it was put out in 2010, by the way. What it looks like is all the hidden costs, not just the subsidies, but, for example, the health effects. If you look at what happens from coal, according to the Academy study, it costs us $62 billion a year to take care of the health effects from air pollution. There are only 80,000 people in the coal industry. You could pension them all off and save a lot of money. I started looking at this comparison of nuclear with more conventional when I was asked to comment on a paper on what the radiation effects of Fukushima were going to be. That paper gave a median over all the life of all the people and the decay of all the radioactivity of 130 people would eventually die. I translated that into years of life lost. And what you see in this fine table, I don't know if this thing has a, oops, I've ruined it. All right, I'm going to forget the business of using the thing. If you look at the middle column, what you'll see is what would have happened if you never produced any electricity from nuclear at Fukushima. You would have had 124,000 years of life lost. And if you looked at the nuclear from Fukushima, it's 26,000. So nuclear is 5 times safer than coal, even including a major nuclear accident. I think it would be interesting if people could take a harder look at this. I don't know how we're going to change the world's view of it. I've already said spent fuel disposal is a political problem. Other countries have used a consent-based system. Sweden, Finland, France, Sweden and Finland. Sweden's is open. Finland is under construction. France, the location is agreed to. We had the Blue Ribbon Commission. It recommended a switch. That's a political issue to switch to a consent-based system. I hope it's done. For all of those who love Yucca Mountain, you have to say that we know more about disposal now than we did then. Back then, Yucca Mountain was considered to be no more difficult than the other disposal sites. Now we know better. You can do it, but it's the hardest. And the easiest are things with alkaline conditions, and they include granite, salt, and clay. Things are a lot easier to do. Let me quickly conclude. The Generation 3 plants are in construction today. If they come in on time and on budget, I believe that we're going to see more nuclear power in the United States. If they come in 5 years late and 2 times over budget, nuclear is going to go away for considerable time. Small modular reactors might be on the market in the early 2020s. Right now, they have to get design certification from the NRC. Gen 4 systems will have lots of R&D to get through before they're ready to be commercialized. The French think that they can do their first commercial one around 2040. That's probably optimistic. That's hard to do. But, Arun, there's an easy terawatt there for you.
Okay, great.
My task will be to tell you about solar. And if I look at solar, the first question I ask is, what is the output? And it's electricity. As a consequence of it, the first question that I ask is, how much of this world do we run on electricity? Actually, all of it. When it comes to the energy we use, half of it we spend on making electricity and half of it we spend on driving cars. When it comes to making electricity by burning coal and natural gas, about 30% of that energy becomes useful electricity. When it comes to burning petroleum to run automobiles, about 15 to 20% of that energy becomes motion. Well, if I had electrical motors, I can convert with 90% efficiency electricity into motion. So if I want to stay at the present standard of my energy use, that is to say, at the present standard of comfort, would I be able to reduce my energy use? And the answer is absolutely yes, by as much as possibly a factor of 3, if the world can be run by electricity. Now, it'd be even better if that could be renewable electricity as time comes on. And indeed, solar provides that option. Nuclear would provide that option as well. Looking at the opportunities and challenges, well, scale of deployment often is not truly understood when it comes to solar. Sun gives us about 1 kilowatt of energy per meter squared. If you need to make a megawatt or a gigawatt, that's a lot of meters squared. And it turns out that we have those meters squared. I'll show you. It's actually a minuscule amount of land compared to the amount of land we right now have. It just takes a long time to actually cover it with active surfaces, such as solar cells. Energy storage is the other really important thing we don't have. That's to say, the reason why fuels are so good is because they happen to be allowing us to do portable energy storage much better than batteries, much better than capacitors, those being the two that might be able to store electricity we might generate from solar. And then lastly, the third point that Arun would want us to make would be to look at the efficiency. And what is it that we can do, for example, in buildings, as we heard in the very first talk of this session. Indeed, topics as simple as light bulbs can make a significant impact on the energy use. 20% of today's electricity is used on lighting. Today's electricity, light bulbs happen to be, at best, 35% efficient in converting electricity into light. Why is it so low when we can do so much better with motors? There's a lot more improvement we can do through innovation on even very simple things like light bulbs. All right, let me though focus on solar and ask, how useful would you find it? Here's a snapshot of advancements just from last year. This is from August 20th, 2012. We are looking at a snapshot in time, and record generation of electricity from solar was done in California. This is almost, actually a little bit more than a gigawatt peak generation of solar power. Now you say that's a lot, and indeed, it's about 10% of all of the renewable portfolio generated that day. It's about 1% of the California electricity for that day. We are a long way from making significant, very, very large contribution to the electricity landscape from solar, but we are on a steady increase. So why do we even focus on solar? And that is simply because there is just so much sun that is abundantly available to us. If indeed we could capture all of the sunlight that the sun gives us in a span of just 1 hour, we would be able to power the entire planet for 1 year. That's, again, a tantalizing statement to make, with recognition that what I just said means we would need to cover the entire surface of the Earth with 10% efficient solar cells, right? So it's really not necessarily an obvious thing to do. All right. It turns out, if I look at this, I can ask, well, what part of our present energy portfolio truly is solar? And it's about less than 0.1%. Small, but rising. I can go ahead and look at the rise of solar or other renewable resources. And this is a plot of renewable power capacity, top line, not including hydro, which is the dominant renewable. And then look underneath the next bar that is boxed in is the solar PV capacity total. You notice that indeed solar is increasing from year to year to year, and actually as a fraction of the total renewable power capacity, excluding hydro, it's rising to about 18% over the past couple of years, doubling. I can look at the same time at wind, and it's staying about steady at about 60%. And even more encouraging than that is if you look at the renewable portfolio of the world, about 50% of the new electric capacity of 2011 is renewable. all renewables of the world presently provide about 20% of global electricity. Well, if you keep on adding 50% more from year to year to year, that 20% number will keep on rising. So we are in the right, again, trajectory, and maybe solar can make a significant impact on that. The one thing that we don't often recognize in the United States is that there are at least 3 different kinds of solar that the world uses. We often focus on solar photovoltaics, but it turns out the most deployed solar technology is solar for heating water. So this is so-called solar thermal heat. You can look at photovoltaics, that they're right there, and then there is the actual heat to generate, turbine motion, and hence use the solar heat to power, generate electricity directly. So let me just very quickly pass, I'm going to use a couple of slides for each one of these to outline the opportunities. I'm going to start with a solar thermal for heat. Well, if I look at the United States contribution, or in utilizing this type of energy, you'll find that we are second in the world in deploying solar thermal systems. The one thing that this graph also shows is I can ask you what's the difference between different solar thermal systems, and there are 3 different types. It turns out our favorite type is the one for heating swimming pools. Not a particularly useful way to utilize the solar energy, but there it is. If you look at China, China utilizes the most efficient way of utilizing solar heat. This is so-called evacuated tubes. Indeed, there are mandates, government mandates for installing these on top of buildings if you want to build a new building. So let me remove heating of the swimming pools and then ask, where do we sit on the world stage of using solar heat? We are not very good. That pie chart on the upper right shows that about 1% of the world solar heat we utilize beyond heating our swimming pools. As a matter of fact, if you look at a chart of a per capita installation of the solar heating capacity, United States is right behind, let's see, Macedonia, right behind Slovakia. Indeed, if you look at the top of the chart, and you can find Cyprus and Israel, the obviously very hot countries, and consequently the ones who could mostly benefit from solar heat. And then look right behind it, a very tropical country of Austria. Well, clearly not. The choice of Austria choosing this is simply because the choice that otherwise they would have to use for heating their homes would be burning of natural gas, which would not be a desirable option. Why do we choose not to install it? Well, we do have plenty of natural gas and oil. So is it easier to install a burning oven, or is it easier to install a solar system? The cost of actual heat would be just about the same, but the convenience of burning simply natural gas is a little bit easier in the US, hence the choice. One thing we could do, indeed, to dramatically reduce the CO2 emissions is to adapt solar hot water heating just like the rest of the world has already done. There are plenty of well-developed technologies. I can go ahead and point to the next technology of solar, and this is by far on the chart of the 3 I'm going to show the least the least deployed. And that is solar hot water to generate steam that can then run turbines to generate electricity. If you look at the power conversion efficiency from heat, that's upper left box, of let's say 6.7 megawatts of thermal energy coming onto a solar system that consists of either parabolic troughs, power towers. There's also an option of so-called portable Stirling dishes. These are mirrors, essentially, that go ahead and capture the sunlight and then focus it onto either a power tower or focus it onto a cylinder that carries a coolant or a heatant, converting the heat to the output of an electrical engine, you will get about 15% conversion efficiency. This is very exciting when it comes to the power conversion efficiency. These are very big systems, though. For these to work, you need to make very, very big systems that might cover half a square mile of mirrors, hence very cost intensive. But if there is a need for storage, they're extremely useful. The heat can be stored, and indeed, these can also be run in conjunction with conventional coal, gas burning power plants. As a result, reutilizing some of the equipment you would have generated otherwise. So why are these not as deployed as other technologies? Well, it's the early days. Indeed, there is an upswing. About 2 gigawatts, almost 2 gigawatts are deployed around the world compared to 70 for the photovoltaics. And as the storage becomes more important to focus on, these indeed will be more dominant. Last technology I'll cite is the photovoltaics, and indeed these are the ones that we might be most familiar in the United States with. Photovoltaics around the world indeed have been on the rise. And again, about 18% of renewable portfolio of the world beyond the hydropower comes from the photovoltaics. The United States is a significant player in this, primarily in adoption. Manufacturing is primarily in Asia, China. When it comes to how much land would we need to actually power the United States, it depends on the numbers you choose to start with. Indeed, if I account for the efficiency of converting coal, natural gas into electricity, to make enough electricity to run the United States, it's a fraction of a percent of land. One way to look at it is if you cover actually Washington, D.C. and Maryland with solar cell, that would be enough to power the United States with solar electricity. And indeed, another way of looking at it is to recognize that there's plenty of land around major highways that no one likes to build a house at because it's too noisy. Those easement lands are sizable and actually can be utilized. They often run next to power lines and can be utilized for the large solar installations if that's what we choose to do. The other thing to recognize is that if we keep on growing at a very, very fast pace, in about 10 years, we should reach about 10% of electricity generated by solar. This is a very fast pace that we could match at low installation levels. It's not necessarily clear that we should be able to also achieve it at higher installation levels, but let's imagine we can. So it's about 10 years to reach about 10% deployment. I can ask, well, what is needed for going beyond 10%? Well, actually large area storage. If I go beyond 10%, at night, I will not have electricity in some areas that do not have a backup due to the gas burning power plant. Right now, we utilize the rest of the grid as the backup for the solar intermittency. Batteries are extremely important for deployment of solar. The one thing that you can recognize beyond that is to notice that if I ask you, if I'm ever only going to reach 10% in the next 10 years, well, how much would I need to sell that electricity for to be cost competitive? And cost of electricity across the United States costs differently. Some places are as low as 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Other places as much as 26 cents a kilowatt hour. If I look at a 10% of most expensive electricity in the US, it costs more than 14 cents a kilowatt hour. This actually is in the range of what solar can achieve today, unsubsidized. And, well, as long as there is backup plants nearby, then it might make a lot of sense for installing solar. Well, what does it cost me to install a solar? Well, the excellence of technological development of silicon and thin film photovoltaics over the past several decades has dramatically reduced the cost down to these levels that now can be cost competitive. Today, solar can compete in some electricity markets, and continued innovation in a PV cell, balance of systems, and installation are absolutely needed. So I can take those 14 cents. Immediately, I need to shave off about 3. Why? Because someone needs to meter those particular electrons I'm going to use and then send me a bill for actually paying for it. That's about 3 cents a kilowatt hour, rough numbers. Remaining 11 cents, most of it will be spent on the balance of system and installation. Why? Because in the United States, we have a very diffuse system of how to install solar technologies. In Germany, there is a single rule across the entire country and a single form, very short one you fill out, and you can go ahead and after you pass the requirements, install your solar system. In the US, that's not the case. Every municipality, state, county has its own set of rules, making it extremely difficult to navigate, and as a result, adding significant costs to the actual installed system of solar. That can be fixed, and that, again, is a government, responsibility in this case. The other thing to imagine is to ask what is coming next that would really make a difference. The one metric that does matter for the developing world is that is a place that needs most of the solar-like electricity. And why do they need most of the solar-like electricity? Simply because developing world that right now, those 3 billion people that do not have or have very scarce access to electricity, they often do not have grid. And if they don't have a grid, they cannot have a nuclear power plant or a coal-burning power plant attached to it with a socket for them to plug into. Solar could be the viable way for them to apply it. If they're going to get electricity through solar, the thing that matters to those parts of the world, actually much more than efficiency, is how much does a solar cell weigh per watt that you generate? Because the cost of delivering the solar cell to the world that is beyond the paved road happens to be the extremely large part of the cost of delivering the energy. So a metric that's often overlooked is a metric of watts per kilogram. How many watts can you give me for a kilogram of a solar cell? And hence, even low efficiency cells, yet lightweight ones, like the ones we generate in conjunction with industry at MIT, that are solar cells on paper, allow you to imagine how to drastically improve that number. Other options are maybe ways to integrate solar in everyday built environment. Can we give you solar cells that look like transparent surfaces? Hence, the windows that you happen to be utilizing every day anyhow and installing every day anyhow can become active surfaces to work with. Again, eliminating some of the balance of systems cost when it comes to installation and infrastructure. Well, this is indeed achievable. However, these are brand new technologies that will require another decade or so to come to fruition of large scale installation. Although one day they can provide energy independence at any scale. Is it by coating large buildings or simply portable electronics in every town, USA? All right, I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions. Do we have the mics around? And yes, we have a question over there.
Ron Feibisch with the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee under Murkowski, Senator Murkowski. On the nuclear, I really liked your presentation. I thought that it was very thoughtful and very pragmatic, and this is what we should expect, and hopefully it will happen. Two comments. On the waste, I think we are very hopeful that you're going to see an action, at least on the Senate side, this year. I think the stars are aligned on both sides to make something happen. Now, on the House side, we really hope that we can work on achieving some type of consensus. So it is political. It's not technical. I agree with you. The second thing, SMRs. I'm a very strong supporter of that business model as a future low-hanging fruit that makes sense for nuclear, for this country and abroad. And one of the issues is how do we create a level playing field for US companies competing with very different business models overseas in deploying small and modular reactors. I think overseas we have a lot of opportunity for this technology, as you so rightfully stated, in terms of the developing world and what they need and the emerging markets. And tied to that, I also believe that perhaps the Department of Defense can be a player in this arena, in this country as a driver. I know that that has been surfaced before, but I'm kind of wondering about your opinions.
I think you've addressed a very important issue, and in fact, it's one that we talked about in this subcommittee of the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board. It's how do you handle the first-of-a-kind costs in the United States? If I was in Europe and I was doing this, the standard procedure would be to take the first-of-a-kind costs and spread them over the first 10 or 15 units. In the United States, people don't do that. They want the first-of-a-kind costs recovered in the first. We're going to have to work down the learning curve to get the costs down to what they claim they can get to, the same per kilowatt as the big guys. And somehow we need to devise an acceptable system to buy a few reactors from each of the first round manufacturers. I think Oak Ridge and TVA are talking about doing that. That's one reactor for one manufacturer. I think in Congress, you've got to think about how you're going to do 3 or 4 reactors for 2 or 3 manufacturers each if you want to see this happen. That's also a political question, and I leave it to you. You're much more expert on how to do that than me. Well, we know how to do it, but I'm being polite.
Secretary Schultz, you had a question.
In California right now, we have a fairly good flow of funds as a result of an initiative that'll be devoted to trying to make a lot of buildings more energy efficient. Public buildings, schools, and other things. What advice do you have for us? How should we go about that?
Well, I guess the one thing I would say is use the tools that are available to be able to assess up front what the expected outcome will be so that you know how to use it well. And not only in terms of a particular project, but also looking at the portfolio. Because one of the challenges with energy efficiency options is one has 100 of them. And everyone will say, well, this will save you 10% if you change this, 20% if you change that. You can't add it all up and get over 100. And there's a lot of interactions of different alternatives that actually affect the net impact on the facility. And I think California could look at all its building types, could look at the alternatives and say in its climate zones, which alternatives economically would have the biggest impact. And that could be weighted to motivate those in terms of a selection. And I think the comment earlier about sometimes we make poor policy choices, we need to make sure that the policy's informed by the numbers and the technology. And I think if we do that, then it'll really assure that the decisions have the desired outcome.
Can I just have a quick follow-up on that? You know,
I want to ask a question, and the same thing, I want to ask a follow-up. What is the problem generated by local building codes, which are a patchwork, they're entirely different here and there, and the terrible complexity of permitting in different neighborhoods? Do we have to fix that problem as well?
Well, I think big picture, boiling the ocean, you'd want to do all of it. You want to get it all lined up. But I think the thing that's exciting about this is something we can walk out the door today and have an impact on.
Good.
yeah. I mean, the follow-up was kind of similar because we never require our buildings to be measured in terms of its performance. We don't know how much energy goes in there, where it goes, and I think you and I have spent some time thinking about it. And if California could do that, because that's the only big industry that, at least I know, that people build things without ever requiring to be tested. And imagine building a 747 without requiring it to be tested. I think it'll, it speaks for itself. So I think that's a measured quantity, because with the measurements, you can then find out where the problems are.
Right? Or having an airplane that's supposed to take you to Singapore and you find out its fuel efficiency is only half. Now, so the measurement's important because that's how you learn. But if you wait until you measure, you've already made the economic payment. And so that's why it's so important to have the right tools to be able to predict accurately enough.
Julio has the mic. Whoever has the mic, I guess, has the question.
Yes, which means this lady over here has immense power. This is a question actually following off of something that Bert mentioned, but actually for the whole panel, including Dr. Majumdar. The Secretary Schultz early on talked about the need for cost as an important measure and to create a level playing field. Around these first-of-a-kind plant costs, you're each looking at your own respective technologies. I think that fossil, either coal or gas with carbon capture and storage, is another one that's facing these early adoption, first-of-a-cost issues. I was wondering if the panel would comment on how they see sort of these different technologies and different options competing relative to each other in terms of electricity use, either on the demand or supply end.
I guess I'll start only by pointing out that solar has a unique position due to the portability of the technology. And as a result, it provides, I think, a solution that cannot necessarily, on the same playing field, be matched to the others. So I do think for the developing world, it is an obvious first step to take. And imagining ways that the third world developing world uses that particular technology, I think was what's needed. Right now, we live in the understanding that how we use the solar, that must be how they use the solar. And it turns out that that's often not the case.
Any other questions? Right over there.
Hi, Jackie Crespo, Cassidy and Associates. I wanted to go back to talking about nuclear, and I agree with you. I think the waste issue, the safety issue, those are all overdrawn, but financing is still a problem, and I know that there's been discussion over the standardization of models. And I was just wondering how much of the construction risk, the cost overruns, could actually be done through standardization, through actually having the licensing of maybe 3 types of reactors and only being able to build those instead of adding all the extra bells and whistles that happened over the last 3 decades. And then if that isn't that big of a gain, do we lose something in pushing for that in terms of innovation and things that we can do through learning by doing and coming down the cost curve by what we learn at each of the construction sites?
Everybody agrees that the variation in parameters of reactors in the Generation 2 era was a really bad thing. There are really only 4 reactors that are now being talked about, and those are the Westinghouse AP1000. There's I forget what its name is, an enhanced boiling water reactor, and there's the French Areva reactor and a Korean reactor. Those 4 are going to be built as reproducible units. You want one of my reactors, you take the standard one because we're not going to modify it for you. That's going to help a lot. And incidentally, one of the advantages claimed for the SMRs is that you don't need to take such a big bite of the capital apple. You want something that's a tenth the power, you have to raise a tenth of the money. And then when you're ready, if you want another tenth, go buy another one. So the difficulty of pulling together this huge amount of capital gets to be much reduced.
Melanie?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Vladimir a question. Obviously, the sun is solar is widely distributed, but conversion to useful energy is another problem, and I'm wondering if you see limitations on either solar or the storage technologies that you need for solar from critical materials or rare earths.
It's a great question. So from the critical material point of view, the solar uses silicon in the most abundant way. So when it comes to the most abundant solar technology, silicon is plenty abundant. The new advanced technologies are looking at thin film uses, and those thin films do need to be judged by what is the complexity of making the material and what is the abundance of the material itself. So often some of the most advanced technologies miss a step, which is that they ask themselves, how do I get the most efficient cells rather than how do I get the most deployable cells? And one of the questions that is worthwhile looking at, for example, is if you're using a new material, make sure that 6 steps, 7 steps is the most chemical synthetic steps that you need to make, because it costs about $1,000 per kilogram to make something, roughly speaking, no matter what it is in the world, on average. That being said, and knowing that you need to have certain thickness of a film and certain amount of efficiency, you get yourself a rational number that tells you that you need to have some choices as you're choosing your materials. On the battery end, batteries have not really progressed dramatically over the past couple of decades. They have progressed, but we are looking at dramatically larger improvements in order to be able to meet the need of what solar is asking for. So we are hopeful. We have a decade before the decade, we can still utilize the grid as a storage. So in this decade, I'm hopeful batteries will advance.
So actually, let me follow up that question on a slightly different angle. For the last 100 years, our electricity system has been centralized generation and then transmission distribution to zillions of loads, right? And I think we are at the cusp of a transition of a distributed electricity system, which in the United States still has to work with our infrastructure. In the other parts of the world, there is no infrastructure, so it's a different ballgame. And I think this is for the panel, where are the barriers today to get to a fully distributed system, and when do you think that might actually happen in an economic way? And are there some policy things that need to happen to enable that? Because there are some other implications, security and others, which are actually very important for a grid.
You want me to shoot my mouth book to say?
Go for it.
I think if you're talking about things that do not need non-existing technology, we're not badly off. And the non-existing technology that you and I have talked about is very large-scale storage, not megawatt hours, but gigawatt days. We don't have the technology to do that. That's going to limit the growth of extremely high variable things like wind. I don't think it's going to limit the growth of solar particularly, and it's not going to limit the growth of geothermal if we can develop it more. So I think the limitations here depend on which renewable technology you're talking about.
Okay. Any other? Hal has a question.
I can speak loudly. I'm Hal Harvey with Energy Innovation. I would like to challenge the hypothesis that storage is required. And call your attention to two studies, one in Europe sponsored by a dozen power companies and one by the National Renewable Energy Lab that both looked at bringing Europe and the U.S. respectively to 80% renewables by 2050. And they both found that storage was not required. There were four things that were required. One is straight transmission lines so you can optimize across the whole country because different sources and different geographies lose covariance as you expand that. The second was demand response, so dispatching demand and managing demand the same way you do supply. Every building has thermal storage, and thermal storage and electricity storage are swappable to some extent. The third was fast ramping fossil, and there's some amazing new technologies which give you the capacity and the backup, but they run very few hours a year, so you don't have the greenhouse gas emissions issues. And finally, was system optimization, which we really don't do much of in this world. So if these two studies have gone through this in detail, and by the way, the NREL model was an hour-by-hour model of the entire U.S. grid with 134 balancing areas from now to 2050, and they showed it, they didn't need storage. That given to me is...
Look, I've read the NREL report, and my answer is if you do not care what your electricity costs, you can do what they say. If you want to put in all sorts of fast-ramping power plants that are going to drive up the cost of natural gas electricity because they're not on very often, then you can do it. I have not read the European study. I have reports from people who have read it, and they believe the same thing, that this is not realistic if you talk about a reliable and affordable system. I have not found a single study, including any NREL study, that includes the cost of firming the load to take care of the variability. You want all sorts of new high-voltage power lines that cost a lot of money. You want all sorts of standby fast-ramping power plants that cost a lot of money. And I want to see a study that does something that includes what it costs to carry it out.
One last question, Bob, you have the mic.
Sure, brief question. Most of you on the panel focus on electricity and decarbonizing the energy system. What about the opportunities for cogen? So we didn't talk much about thermal. Vladimir mentioned it briefly, but do you see much opportunity in cogen and district heating? We don't do so much of that in this country, but in other countries there's much more of it.
I would say it's a great question because if you think about building loads, a lot of it is hot water. And certainly there's systems out there such as fuel cells, which maybe while expensive have shown if you look at the overall efficiency, if you use the waste heat, you can get 90% deployed in a building, not in a lab. And so there's huge opportunities, and this is where I think Arun's question earlier about distributed. A lot of things are better to be done centrally. If you have a gas-fired plant, you can be more efficient there than if you have a microturbine in your backyard. On the other hand, the gas-fired plant doesn't have an opportunity to use the waste heat. Whereas if you're in a building and you need hot water for washing towels or hospitals, you have that opportunity to do that. And then obviously the question is, what do you do in terms of installation costs and integration? But I think if you look at that as a whole picture, again, it's a system view. You can really, that's a great point.
I think we may have one more hour of questions, but I don't think we can stay here for another hour. We'll be kicked out of this panel, of the stage. So thank you very much. Let's thank all the panelists.
Good talk. Good talk. I'd love to steal some of your slides.
I'll give it to you.
I may send you an email.
Please do.
And I'm pleased to meet you. I thought that was very interesting. Are some of the building reports you talked about on your website?
Well, I can send them to. I can send you the links. Do you have a card? I'd be
I
happy.
do.
I'm a Stanford